past few episodes, we've covered topics such as how to repurpose content and how to squeeze your podcast into your jam-packed calendar. In this episode, you're going to hear more about batching, the art of being efficient with the time that you have. My guest in this episode is Lisa Zawrotny, host of Positively Living, Do Less, Live More, Breathe Easier. Lisa lives and breathes productivity, but she does it in a way that's less hustle and more flow. You're going to learn what the purpose of batching is, whether it's something that may help you or not, plus what other things you can batch to make you feel like you can breathe easier. I'm Alison Fraser, host of Women Who Podcast, the show for side hustling women who are ambitious but time limited. Each week, I bring you real life stories and actionable tips to help you create and grow your own podcast. Let's get into it. Welcome on, Lisa. We're going to be talking about batching, but firstly, your podcast is called Positively Living with the subtitle Do Less, Live More, Breathe Easier. And I feel that batching kind of is your podcast.
Is when you say that, do you mean that we're trying to be efficient, right?
Yeah.
We can say what we need to say, but we don't have to make it quite so complicated, right?
Yes. So we are going to be talking about batching that will, I guess, help us to breathe easier. Before we even get started on how we can batch, can you give our listeners a brief explanation as to what batching is?
Sure. So the idea, and this is a productivity concept of taking like activities and putting them together at the same time. And essentially in this context, we'd be doing creating episodes ahead. But when you think about it, batching could also mean like batch processing, collecting the guests that you're going to have. It doesn't have to be the development of each and every episode. And actually, one of the ways that I feel like I'm ahead of the game in terms of my planning for my podcast is by batching my guest searching and connection.
So when you say batching your guest searching, are you doing all of that in just one fell swoop rather than thinking week to week as to which guests you'd like to have on?
That's exactly right. So using this one example, and this is something that I found very successful, is I will have an ongoing search, maybe, month to month to keep an eye out, have conversations, connect with people. There are wonderful, groups on Facebook, for example, where I can find and connect with amazing people such as yourself. And I will monitor that, but I will dedicate a specific time, usually quarterly or so, because I like to know ahead of time where I'm going, have my lineup, understand generally who my guests are, how they connect to my theme, and then where I have to fill in. And by connecting with guests during that time, like in a batch, right? Going into the groups, finding different people, reaching out, using one day essentially to reach out and send a bunch of messages, set up a bunch of either connection calls or chats, and sort of filtering through them. And then getting that idea and sort of laying out a plan, that's a form of batching that can make me feel a lot more calm about what's to come in the podcast, even though we haven't recorded yet.
Yeah, I suppose it is taking a bit of panic away or anxiety about if you haven't got a guest booked for the following week's show, for example. You don't want to have that last minute just trying to get anyone, when really the way you have described it and the way that I've done it for the next few episodes of my podcast is getting all your ducks lined up in a row, as it were, getting them in the schedule, know that it's going to happen and it will all come out in good time.
Yeah. And I think that's a really important point, because a lot of times we do think about batching as, well, let me create a bunch of podcast episodes in a row. And that can really work, especially if you're doing solo episodes. You put a bunch together. And the reason why it's so popular from a productivity standpoint is that you're gathering all the things that you need, your tools, your time, and you're using your energy for something that's consistent. When we are trying to do tasks and we shift from one type of task to another, there's a lot of energy that's lost. So that's why batching is so popular. And to your point, when you have a bunch of episodes that you've recorded, and they're in the queue, that can feel a lot better if you get to a week where everything goes backwards and life is lifing you so hard. And you're like, how am I going to get this podcast done? So yes, that can absolutely reduce the anxiety. Yeah. But when I was thinking about this topic for today, I was thinking too that batching is not always for everyone though, because sometimes I found with clients that trying to batch process certain tasks can feel, anxiety inducing for them. So I think you have to know what feels better, that you know what's happening and that you have it recorded and set ahead of time, or that you have some freedom and flexibility to change things up or to do it closer to the time it's going to air. I think you have to know what feels better to you. And I know that for me, I like planning and setting up the framework and expressing the intention and being in contact with guests, for example. And that's enough because then we have some flexibility to change as the date gets closer. That's like a happy medium for me. And I think we all need to find that.
Yeah. I kind of do batching, but then I kind of don't. As you say, when life gets lifing, I had that just last week. I already had 4 episodes already ready. And then I started recording some other interviews with the intention of editing and having those ready to queue up. And just had a whole, actually 10 days of where things just got way too much in other aspects of life. And I still haven't done the editing for those, but I know that I'm, a little bit ahead of myself so that I can sit down and get through those. But the batching I tend to do is I tend to transcribe all my interviews in one go, and then I'll edit in one go. So I won't do, say, for example, our chat that we're having. I won't necessarily do every single step for this episode one after the other. I might go through our chat and then one that I'm going to do next week or one that I've done last week, just to keep those kind of tasks together. Is that something that you would do yourself?
Yeah, I think that some of the benefits of approaching that in that kind of batching, I should say, that task or almost administrative batching is very similar to how I'm setting up my lineup for the podcast and reaching out and sending emails. And, so the same idea, if you will, if you're running the transcription for each, it's a different kind of task that's not necessarily not in the same creative mode as when you are interviewing and you're present, right? And you're even thinking about what the interview questions might be for that episode. This is more of a rote kind of task where you get in, you have steps, a process checklist, if you will. And it makes a lot of sense where you're already in that zone, in that energy, and you're doing that thing to repeat that a bunch of times for other episodes. So I think that's an excellent use of your time. And it can, even though you're not maybe completing a full episode because you're doing a portion of the task, it can still be very efficient in terms of the amount of time you use and probably even the focus you have and making fewer mistakes because you're not distracted by the different kinds of tasks that you're doing.
Yeah. And then when you're batching the scheduling of your podcast, that's really satisfying to do like 4 in a row. It doesn't take very long.
Yeah. So, as I said, when I thought about batching, I thought about, you're creating content and you have it in the queue and you're ready to go. I do think that's important. And that can also be, it reminds me of meal planning. When you're cooking a meal, you cook a little extra so you have something left over. So that can be a good thing. The other place where you can do batching in terms of content would be if you have some evergreen content. And I guess that would be the distinction that I would make. We have to know if it's right for us or not. What kind of podcast do you have? Is it something that really speaks to current events or where you like to bring up things that are current, then that may be something where you wait a little bit longer. You find that area that's comfortable. I don't like to wait longer than about, 2 weeks out from air date. That gets me more nervous if I'm closer to that, but that's still pretty close because I know some people who will record an episode, 3 months or even 6 months earlier, and that feels way too far out for me. But if you have content, maybe it's a solo episode or something that's going to apply, like when we talk about batching, it doesn't matter what's going on in the world. This idea is universal. It is evergreen. And no matter when you are listening to this, something will resonate. And I hope you're inspired to take action and find the right way to batch for you. So this is a great example of an episode that you could record at any point in time. That's when content creation like that makes sense. So yeah, it really just depends on your comfort levels, your content creation in terms of like what you're sharing, and then what makes sense when you put that all together. I always call podcasting a puzzle, and I think you have to figure out what your puzzle is.
Oh, that is so true. Lisa, when you started your podcast, did you start batching straight away, or did you just find your way to work out what was best for you?
So in the very beginning, I actually used batching a bit more. And I'm so glad you asked this question because it's another question we need to ask ourselves in terms of our comfort level. When I first started, I didn't quite know who my guests would be, or I had people in mind because I knew them. But as you grow as a podcaster, your network expands and things change. So at the very beginning, I had a few people in mind, but I was also new in terms of being an interviewer. And I decided I would start with solo episodes. I would start with my foundational content as a podcast strategist. I wanted people to understand where I was coming from. I had different approaches to productivity, or as a productivity strategist with my podcast. I wanted them to understand where I was coming from that was slightly different than usual, that I was anti-hustle and anti, like burnout culture, and rather more about compassionate productivity. Those are some unusual concepts, I guess. And I wanted to make sure people understood that. So I batched ahead. It's also recommended when you're first starting out that you have a number of episodes, maybe 3 at least, ready to go when you launch, right? Because I know for me, when I'm listening, if I like something, I want to hear more, like right away. I'm a binge listener. So you want to make sure that you have something more than one episode for people to hear. It also felt more comfortable for me because I wasn't sure about my process. I wasn't sure how long it would take me. I was a newbie. So I think in the beginning, it can be really helpful. Now I'm more confident in what I have to say, how it will work, how quickly I can turn around an episode, whether it's solo or guest. So I feel like I have more wiggle room. But in the beginning, yeah, batching was essential. It made me feel a lot.
What other areas of your life do you apply batching to, Lisa?
That's a great question. I did mention one already, and that is like meal prepping and planning, right? I will batch when it comes to grocery shopping. I will batch when it comes to cooking because there's a lot of things that you can cook at one time, like when you're already chopping vegetables, and doing certain things, you can do that quite easily. Batching when it comes to energy is so important to consider. I don't like making phone calls. There, I said it, and I know I'm not the only one. I just don't. Text me, send me an email. I mean, I love having a conversation with you today, one-on-one, but a phone call, oh, it just gets to me. So I will batch those. I will have a collection that I need to do, and just get this out of the way, and then you can go get yourself an iced coffee, and things will be much better. So I'll reward myself. So I'll batch things that are like, again, it's that same focus. I'm using the phone and calling people and I'm taking notes as I do. And it's like one type of task, but it's also a task that I'm not a fan of. So that's another great example of how I use batching. What about you, Alison?
I'm trying to think what I also batch. I wish I could batch my exercise because I do a minimum 2K run or walk every day. And sometimes it's a real squeeze to fit it in. I don't really batch meal prep. I probably should. I do like the idea of chopping vegetables all in one go, but I'm a come home from work, dice an onion to get started on the cooking of the dinner. But we always do have leftovers because then I've got lunch ready for myself the next day.
Well, there you go. So that's another form of efficiency. And as I said, batching is not for everyone and not for every task, but it can work. Another way I guess I consider batching, if you will, would be when I work with clients. I have certain days, Mondays and Wednesdays, especially, that are big client days. And so I call them theme days, but that's a form of batching, if you will, where then you have dedicated days that belong to a certain category of activity. That can be really helpful. And another funny way that just came to me as you were asking this question is that sometimes I batch my show watching because everything's either on demand or recorded and I don't have the time for it, but then we'll sit down. Okay, you call it binge, I call it batch. Let's
I like
let's
that.
reframe it in a positive way, because sometimes it's like, grab the popcorn. We are catching up on these 3 episodes. And I, for one, am a huge fan of that. I know it gets a bad rap sometimes, but I think it's
No.
awesome. And yeah, if it's the weekend and you're hanging with the family and you're catching up on The Mandalorian. It is what it is.
I love that reframe, batch watching. I'm batch watching Peaky Blinders at the moment. Completely
Well, there you
missed
go.
the whole hype from all the years that it's been going. And over the last 3 weeks, I've watched just wrapping up season 4. So I'm batch watching that. But I realized another thing that I do batch, and that's paying bills.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
I don't pay them as they come in, like their power bill and their Wi-Fi bill are the most ones. And then there's a few other things that come in, but I tend to sit down in one go and just pay this one, this one, this one. So I'm in my banking app and I just do it all at once rather than having to remember oh, have I already paid that one? It's no, I haven't done my monthly bill paying.
That's a great example. And it shows how, when you're in the moment, you're in the platform, you're in that energy of doing that your focus can be different. Plus, it's a way to say, okay, I've collected these and I've completed them. And now I don't have to wonder because I've been doing it piecemeal. That's a great example. Love that.
I know people who batch emails as well. Like when you were saying with batching your phone calls, and I've heard people who will only go into their emails at one time a day and go through their emails there and then rather than checking constantly. And I can see how checking emails constantly is a bit of a time suck. I mean,
That's
I have the notifications come up on my watch and that does divert attention away from what I'm doing at the time. So maybe I should probably disconnect my watch from my phone.
Yeah, or turn off whatever notifications you can turn off so that you are choosing, your device isn't choosing when you go to check. You're absolutely right. As a productivity strategist, one of the first things I'm going to say is what notifications and what systems are constantly coming at you and reminding you. You need to say you're the boss. And email checking at dedicated times is an awesome suggestion. Yes. Usually we'll say, at the beginning of your workday and the end of your workday, it can be challenging when you are used to being in that responsive, urgent, reactive mode. So to be proactive and to have that gap will take some time, but you can set things in place like auto responses. You can communicate with people to say, I will check first thing in the morning, at lunch, and in the afternoon. You can get people used to the fact that you are not responding instantaneously.
I think I call this the microwave culture that we're in at the moment because we're so used to having things in an instant.
Yeah.
When you're cooking with a microwave, 30 seconds done. And it's not you probably also remember these days, Lisa, of having dial-up internet and you could make yourself a cup of tea in the time it took for a page to load.
Yeah.
So we're used to that wait for things. Well, we were used to that wait for things, but now it's like, why isn't it loading? When things do pop up in an instant.
Oh, I've become so impatient. I'm like, request, something from a website that, they send you a freebie of some kind or some information. And I'm like, it's 30 seconds and I haven't gotten into my email inbox yet. What's going on here? It's amazing how on demand, right? We've become. So to that point, it does take some conversation. It does take managing expectations, ours and others, but it's definitely worth it. And to your question about email, I will check at certain times. And then I will also, when, for example, I'm reaching out and inviting guests, sending them the formal invitation with inquiry form and details, that I will do in a batch. Because again, I've got the template right there. I'm ready to go. I have the information and then I send out a bunch of them. Whereas when I'm sending out an email that, thanks my guest for coming on the show and gives them all the wonderful materials to share, the graphics and links and content to share, that's, once a week or once, whenever the guest shows up, probably 1 to 2 times a month at this point. So that's like a singular situation. So I will do that. But again, it's first thing in the morning when I'm checking email and sending messages. So I guess ultimately things kind of batch themselves sometimes depending upon your habits and your structure for the day.
Yeah, there are lots of things we can batch. And as you say, lots of things that are probably best not to batch. But we all develop our own system. And I guess, as you were saying earlier, it's not for everyone. And it's learning what fits you and your personality and the way you work.
Yeah, well said.
So don't beat yourself up if you try batching and it's not for you.
Yeah, I mean, and some people in podcasting love to, do it like very close to when the episode airs because they like the excitement of it. Sometimes they need the sense of urgency. I don't always encourage that because I know for some of us, we're 11th hour folks, right? And that's not always the healthiest. That can also cause stress. So again, it's about finding that balance and that harmony that feels good. But if you like a little bit of that excitement of putting something out, or you like that freedom and flexibility, I work with creatives all the time. And I know myself, when it comes to my solo episodes, I have a bunch like of ideas ready to go and sometimes partly fleshed out episodes, but I will also have something planned, be ready to go, be working on it, and then say, nope. And I change my mind because something else is on my heart, on my mind, and I have to do it. And then I end up writing that, so quickly, allowing yourself that freedom and flexibility to be authentic and to do what works for you. Yeah. Don't beat yourself up about your system. Own it. As long as it's working for you, then it works.
Those are all very great tips for new podcasters and not so new podcasters. But what have you learned from podcasting yourself as a tip that you would pass on to someone who's thinking about starting a podcast, not batch related?
Oh my gosh, I've learned so much from podcasting. I think the thing that comes to my mind and heart and the most when you say that is the connection with people, how much you learn by just being in this moment, in these conversations and collaborating in this way. It is so powerful. You make good friends. You have a community of people that truly, genuinely support each other. I'm constantly impressed by podcasters and how we treat each other and how we work with each other. But yeah, I would say that by doing it, you are going to learn so much more than you ever bargained for. That's not so much a tip as just an encouragement. If you're on the fence or you're thinking about it, do it. It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, I think podcasts is different to other I guess, other groups of people where you always want to be the best yourself and you'll do anything to be better than your peers. But with podcasting, I found that we all want everyone to be as good as they can be and for their podcast to be as successful as we want ours to be.
Yeah, it's one of those places I think that makes it so easy to understand it's collaboration over competition. I want your podcast to succeed like I want mine to succeed. And it's easy to do that. And it's easy for each of us to say, oh, you're listening to this one, listen to the other one too. You're on the same platform, go over and have a listen. And you trust that we're all sharing these ideas that connect and inspire. And, everyone needs something different. Like they may not need the topics I'm talking about right now, but at some point they will. And yeah, when we share like this, I think this is the case in every industry. I would love to see it, but I think naturally it occurs in podcasting, and I love that.
Mm. Yeah. So on that note, are there a couple of podcasts that you like to listen to that you would like to share with the listeners?
Definitely. So another podcast strategist, Alicia Galati, has Listeners to Leads, which I really appreciate. She has podcast related guests on there as well. So that's a wonderful complement to this. Also, I'm constantly thinking about my content, and Emily Aborn has an episode, a podcast, I should say, with episodes about content with character. And that's really, coming at it from an authentic viewpoint. And I really appreciate that. If you are thinking about how you're presenting, if you are not only a podcaster, but want to be a speaker, I love Carol Cox's Speaking Your Brand, and I've been listening to that for a very long time. If you are looking for business support, Natalie Ekdahl's Biz Chicks podcast is another favorite of mine. I've been listening to that forever, and I always give her credit for encouraging me to become a podcaster. And women podcasters, man, we especially stick together. And so I'm always appreciative of the job she did trailblazing for us. And I definitely credit her with what I'm doing today. And now I get to be one of the more experienced ones, and it's amazing.
Well, thanks for those recommendations, Lisa. I'm going to stick those in the show notes for people to be able to find the links to those. And you mentioned Emily Aborn, and when we were talking earlier about, talking about finding guests and batching that, I found you, or you found me, from a post that I made looking for guests for certain topics. And you recommended Emily to me, and she was on just I think a couple of weeks before this episode. And yeah, we had a wonderful conversation, and I'm still actually on a bit of a high from that one. And you have added to that because you both have such great insight into podcasting, but also not just the podcasting itself, but how you can make things a little bit easier or better with the expertise you both have. But thank you for that.
I'm so glad. Thank you. Well, thank you. And it's my delight. I adore Emily, and she was gushing about your conversation as well. And see, this is just one amazing example of how we can connect with each other, connect to each other, and really share the wealth here.
Yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to add? Maybe tell us a bit more about what you do with your podcast. We haven't really touched on that, Lisa, and I feel like I've done a bit of a disservice.
Oh, well, thank you for asking. I'm really proud of Positively Living. And, the idea here is that we want to talk about, I guess, topics that can help you beyond what we think of as traditional productivity. So we do talk about productivity, but we talk about self-awareness and self-development, mom life, parent life, entrepreneurship, habits, systems, organizing. It's actionable advice. Every single episode goes through this framework. I'm big on frameworks, and I love them because I feel like there's a comfort in them. And productivity is my thing, right? So it kind of makes sense. But where you will hit the topic, we'll discuss why we even care about it, what's involved, what we need to know, and then what we can do. So each time you walk away with like that feeling, at least this is my intent, my mission, is for you to walk away with hope and maybe a good laugh, because I'm always joking. But we can't take things so seriously, right? I certainly don't take myself seriously. We need to have fun with it, and we need to know that it is possible. So many times, I think we have these topics of how we can, get things done, and it feels so serious, so difficult, so challenging. And I am absolutely on a mission to say it's not. Let's make this simpler and make it doable and make you feel like you can. And I think a big part of that is also understanding we have full lives with all kinds of things happening to us, with us, for us. There are heavy things like trauma and grief, and my podcast speaks to that. We have to be trauma informed and to understand like all of the elements that are like our foundation as people and how that affects how we show up and what we do and whether batching works for us or not. We need to understand how neurodiverse we all are. The whole idea of neurodiversity and having some kind of like traditional neurological ability or focus seems strange to me. We're all diverse. We all work differently, and we need to understand how we work in order to be our most productive and ultimately our happiest. So these are the conversations that we have, and I approach it by saying, what do we need to talk about in these like frameworks or pillars, right, of simplicity and self-awareness systems? It's the mantra, do less, live more, breathe easier. As long as we're talking about aspects of our lives that can touch upon those, that belongs in our conversation, and we keep it real and authentic. And I know that word is used so many times, but really it's cutting away the perceptions and getting to the truth of the matter, and then walking away feeling like, okay, I got this. Or even if I don't got this, it's okay, because I'm going to figure it out.
Oh, that does sound like something that we should all be listening to. I think most people would like to do less and live more and breathe easier.
Yeah, just even hearing that, right? Take a deep breath right now. Inhale through your nose, out through your mouth. Just take a moment. That does wonders.
Yeah. On that note, thank you so much, Lisa. It's been wonderful chatting with you and hearing your ideas of how we can batch and everything else. It's been a wonderful way to spend my morning.
It's been my pleasure, Alison. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thanks again, Lisa, for this conversation. I loved the reframe from binging on something to batching. That feels so much more positive. I mentioned how I batch my podcast processes. For example, this was the second set of intros and outros I wrote out of 3 episodes. I also batch wrote my show notes, and when I uploaded this episode to my podcast host, I did that with a couple more episodes. Lisa also shared how she likes to batch her guest outreach, and that's something I started doing a few weeks ago. Now, if I see someone who I think might be a good guest, then I screenshot their post on Facebook or add it to my notes, and I save the outreach for when I want to spend a couple of hours researching. It's going well so far, so thanks, Lisa, for that tip. Of course, batching may not suit you. If you do something else to get your podcast produced in a way that helps you keep on top of it, I would love to hear from you. You can send in an email to alison@alisonfraser.co. And if you do, I would love to share that on a future episode. All links to Lisa and the podcast she mentioned are in the show notes. So thanks for listening. That's it from me this week, and I'll speak to you again soon. You've been listening to Women Who Podcast, the podcast for women with something to say.